All right, let's bring in Antony Loewenstein. He's a Middle East affairs analyst and the author of the Palestine Laboratory. He joins me now from Sydney, Australia. Anthony, good to talk to you. We knew some of the elements of this proposed plan had been floating around for a little bit, but I want to start off by asking you what your initial thoughts are.
It's remarkably similar to what's happening in the West Bank and has been for years, where the Palestinian Authority, which has been around for decades, deeply corrupt, unbelievably unpopular with Palestinians, has been maintaining the occupation for Israel. In other words, they are almost a police force for the Israeli military, although, of course, they have no real control ultimately because the ultimate control is Israel. So if the plan is to do something similar in Gaza, and it's worth saying that while this plan has been announced, behind the scenes, there's been lots of talk from Netanyahu and other senior ministers that this is not the only plan on the table. These other thoughts, in a way, their ideal vision, frankly, is to try to remove as many Palestinians as possible from Gaza. So what they've announced today, in my view, is far from the likely inevitable plan.
Let's talk about some of those more controversial aspects that had been discussed. As you said, that there are some factions within the Netanyahu government who are talking about exile. They're talking about Jewish settlements in the territory. These are controversial proposals. How much does Netanyahu risk in terms of pushing ahead with this proposed plan in terms of the stability of his coalition government?
There's no doubt that two of the senior ministers, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, are two of the key people proposing the idea, essentially, of, I mean, they call it voluntary migration, but essentially it's forcing Palestinians to leave and find some other countries. And Israel apparently, or reportedly, is speaking to nations like Congo and others to take some. Now, realistically, a country like Congo is not going to take 2 million people. They might take 10,000 here, 20,000 there. The issue is not so much Netanyahu's coalition, and that's obviously part of it. It's also the fact that there's a lot of support in the Israeli Jewish public, and I say that based on public opinion polls before October 7 and very much since, of the idea of removing as many Palestinians as possible. There was a poll about 2 weeks ago in Israel that found that 70 to 80% of Israeli Jews supported the idea of essentially forcing Palestinians to leave Gaza. Now, it doesn't mean necessarily they support putting in settlements. That is a view that is not shared by all Israelis. But the idea somehow that a Palestinian Authority type group, or the PA itself, would have any legitimacy. And also, let's not forget, as you said at the end of your introduction, Gaza has been destroyed. It's been destroyed for the last 3 months. It's currently going to be arguably unlivable at the end of this process. I would seriously question whether many nations are going to want to essentially rebuild something, Gaza, that has been destroyed by Israel. I say neighboring states, particularly Arab nations.
Yeah. Since you mentioned public opinion polls, I mean, I want to sort of maybe shift the conversation over to the possibility of elections taking place in Israel. Officials like Benny Gantz, we know that he is more lukewarm to the presence of the Palestinian Authority. This could all be a big question mark if Netanyahu is no longer in office, if you think about the medium to longer term plans for Gaza.
It could be, but it's worth saying that people like Benny Gantz or Yair Lapid, who are the likely alternatives, or Naftali Bennett, who was Prime Minister before and may return, all their views on these issues meaning control of the West Bank, endless occupation, increasing settlements, are remarkably similar. I think we too often in the West obsess over Netanyahu. Clearly he's the Prime Minister and we can't ignore him, obviously. But the other likely alternatives on the key issues are no different. They're no different. So there could be an election in Israel, and if there was, according to public opinion polls, Netanyahu would lose very badly, and Benny Gantz could be the Prime Minister. But I think ultimately the US and the European vision, if I can call it that, is essentially to try to replicate the West Bank in Gaza, and it will not work because in the West Bank, it's not working. It hasn't worked for years, and Palestinians there themselves do not regard the PA as legitimate at all.
Okay. I mean, you touched upon an important point. I mean, the United States is inevitably going to be involved in a post-conflict Gaza. Talk to us about what you think the scope of that is going to be.
Look, with Biden as president, obviously he's there till at least the end of the year. And after that, of course, anyone's guess, could be Trump or somebody else. that their vision, the so-called US vision, which I've articulated pretty clearly after October 7, has been the Palestinian Authority. They've been speaking to the PA, they've been speaking to Mahmoud Abbas, who is 87, aging, sick, cannot have long in this world anymore, clearly. And their vision is a PA type, or the PA itself in Gaza, somehow controlling Gaza or running it. But ultimately, as I said, what is that vision when Gaza itself has barely any infrastructure? Hospitals have been destroyed, schools, roads, there's nothing there. And that's not even when the war is over. So I think ultimately the US and frankly many Arab states who ultimately during this process, and I even read today, no Arab nation has cut ties with Israel, not one. So the rhetoric is one thing. They're outraged by what's going on in Gaza, sure. But ultimately they will keep ties. And ultimately, I suspect they'll be happy to go along, to some extent at least, with what Israel, the US, is proposing, because as far as they're concerned, they regard the Palestinian issue as an inconvenience. They're very happy, as the Abraham Accords a few years ago was aimed to do, to bury the Palestinian issue. So for them, a corrupt, complicit Palestinian authority, akin to their own rule in their own nations, Egypt, Jordan, etc., is their vision. I just don't think Palestinians are going to accept it.
Yeah, great stuff. It's a pleasure listening to your analysis. Antony Loewenstein, thank you for joining us here on the NewsHour.